Welcome to Neuroscience for Learning. Let's take a quick look first at the structure and function of the brain, and we'll start with the brain stem, which is connected to the spinal cord and allows us to do autonomic functions, things like your heartbeat and your breathing. Next to that, we have the cerebellum, which is responsible for motor movement or the ability to do things like run in a smooth motion. These, along with what we sometimes call the reptilian brain and the limbic system, are sort of ancestral. Um, Above this, in color in this diagram, is our cerebrum, or the area that we think of as the mind. So let's start with the occipital lobe at the back, here in red, which is responsible for vision. It allows us to interpret the wavelengths of light that our retina picks up and create the picture of the world that you see around you in all of its color and shape. Next to that, in green, we have the temporal lobe, which is mainly responsible for hearing, but also allows us to understand language. It also has some structures that are important in encoding memory and emotional response. Above this, the parietal lobe in yellow is responsible for sensory information like feeling, pain, heat, and it also gives us a sense of where we are in space. And finally, in blue in the front, and what is really interesting in humans is our huge frontal lobe. Now, the frontal lobe is responsible for things like logic, reasoning, decision making, higher cognitive functions. It's also what allows us to create verbal speech and has fine motor control so that you're able to do things like write or tell your body what to do with its muscles. The frontal lobe might be seen as your actual mind, what makes you you. Now, obviously, we know these things because of long ago, we could tell when someone had a stroke or Alzheimer's that their brain actually functioned in a different manner. Nowadays, we have scans that can allow us in real time to see different parts of the brain light up when different activities are undertaken. And we'll see that the activity of learning really requires the whole brain. So now that we know what the different parts are sort of responsible for, we can understand that all the parts of the brain are necessary in learning. Imagine yourself in a classroom. You're looking up at the board using your occipital lobe to see. Your temporal lobe is interpreting the voice of the teacher and trying to understand what they're saying. Your frontal lobe is responsible for trying to connect and create logical reasoning from what is being taught. And then your frontal lobe also responsible for either writing notes or responding verbally to a question. So all of these parts need to be able to communicate with one another. And the way that the brain communicates with itself is in fact through neurons. So neurons are the cell that are responsible for sending signals all over the body. You have about 100 billion neurons in your brain, give or take, depending on the latest research, but you have an abundance of them, and they're pretty much with you for life. So a neuron in itself isn't much different from a regular cell in that it does still have a cell body, a nucleus, but it has these other areas that are specific for communication. So the dendrites will take in information from the previous neuron and transfer it down along an axon. The axon can be short or long, depending on the actual physical distance in your body it needs to go. So axons in your brain might be short, but those going from your toe up to your spinal cord might be very long. And at the end of the axon, we have the axon terminals, where another neuron would then be connected. You'd have dendrites near those axon terminals ready to take that information. Now, without trying to go into too much detail of the biology or indeed chemistry of it, suffice it to say that one of the ways that neurons communicate along the axon is through electrical impulse. So you have positive, negative charges inside and outside the membrane of the neuron, which are because of positive ions like sodium and potassium being actively pumped. And when the neuron is excited, it will switch those positive and negatives by opening channels in the membrane, and that will create an electrical impulse that goes down the length of the neuron and towards the next neuron. In this way, your brain is able to physically connect different neurons together. And it's those connections between the dendrites and the axon terminals that determine the path that information can take in your brain. And it's the creation of those new paths that we think of as learning. Now, another important aspect is what happens at the axon terminals. And while sometimes the information can continue to be transferred via the electrical impulse, other times we use chemicals called neurotransmitters. So in the synapse, which is this space between axon terminal and the next dendrite, we have the ability to release chemicals which float in the synaptic cleft and are uptaken by the next dendrite. And these are neurotransmitters, and they can either excite or inhibit the next neuron. Neurotransmitters you have all heard of before. They are things like adrenaline and endorphins, serotonin, dopamine, and they all have different structures which allow them to either excite or inhibit different parts of the neurons. Now, having a neurotransmitter like adrenaline pumping through your brain will obviously not allow you to sit down and calmly read a paragraph and internalize what that says. So there are certain neurotransmitters that we have even dubbed learning or memory, which do increase the ability to calmly concentrate on a task. So we now know that the brain has many different parts and that they all need to communicate together with neurons in order for us to be able to think. And learning is simply the rewiring of the brain, changing the pathways that neurons are taking, strengthening the pathways between neurons, connecting new ones, and sometimes forgetting old connections. So you use all of your brain, and you need so much energy for this process to occur. In fact, your brain is the hungriest organ in your body. It takes about 25% of all of your fuel. So your fuel, which in the case of the brain is oxygen and glucose, so that it can create that ATP molecule that the cell uses to do its work, it's taking up 25% of your fuel. So nutrition is very important to being able to learn, because nutrition is important to the brain's proper functioning. Another thing that we have recently shown is very important to learning is sleep. So while you sleep, your brain does not turn off. It continues to go through those same pathways that you had created throughout the day, and it consolidates them. Another thing that is important is to create an environment for learning, and that is one that isn't stressful or frightening, because neurotransmitters respond to the stress or if they feel fear, and having the stress neurotransmitters, things like cortisol, will limit your ability to encode new memory and so limit your ability to learn. So creating an environment where the student is well fed, has had abundance of sleep, and feels comfortable will increase the potential for learning.